Welcome to a presentation brought to you by the American Wood Council. Thank you for your participation in our webinar today. This webinar is intended to provide general information only and does not constitute professional or engineering advice. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and by remaining a participant, you automatically consent to such recordings. If you do not consent to being recorded, please disconnect from the session. This presentation is worth 1.5 LUHSW with the AIA and 0.15 credits with the ICC. To receive credit for the course, you must attend this webinar for a minimum of 80 minutes. At the end of 80 minutes, you will see your certificate appear on your webinar console. Your certificate will also be uploaded into your learner profile on learn.awc.org, provided you registered for today's webinar with the same email address as your account profile. At the end of today's session, our presenter will have a live Q&A with the audience. Please input your questions into the Q&A panel throughout the session. And now for today's presentation.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to Safeguarding Buildings During Construction, Fire and Life Safety Best Practices. My name is Ray O'Brocki. I'm the Director of Fire Service Relations for the American Wood Council. Before that, I did 23 years in the Baltimore City Fire Department, where I was the fire marshal, the fire official, and I retired as the assistant chief of the department. After retirement, I went over to become the chief building official for the city of Rockville, Maryland, a little town outside of Washington, D.C. And I tell you that not only so you know who's talking with you today, but also to illustrate, I come at this issue from both a fire service perspective and a building department perspective, and that's going to be relevant when I go into one of my talks later on in the program. You all know the American Wood Council here, so I don't need to. You've probably tuned into a lot of our different webinars, some of what we do. Now this, we're going to discuss hazard mitigation on large construction sites. While we will focus on large construction sites, the codes and the standards to safeguard them also apply to projects that are smaller in scale. This course was created for a broad audience of fire inspectors, building inspectors, any kind of code official, construction managers, architects, engineers, anybody who touches construction sites. So if some of the information seems on the basic side, that is why. So today we're going to talk about the risk and hazards associated with construction sites. We're going to talk about the codes and the standards that apply to safeguard constructions. We're going to talk about some best practices because a lot of those best practices become codes eventually. And we're going to talk about the components of a well thought out, well executed fire safety plan. I'm also the administrator of the Construction Fire Safety Coalition. You can go to www.constructionfiresafety.org. It has resources in there. It has links to resources. It has checklists and guidance documents. And also we send out a quarterly newsletter. This is our Facebook page. We have a companion Facebook page. You can post on there. You can ask questions, but we are on Facebook. Gets us to our first polling question. What is your profession? So if you're an architect, an engineer, a code official, member of the fire service, if you're in private industry, please answer now. So in 2022, the NFPA researcher Richard Campbell put out a report. He's done it a couple times in on different subjects, but probably one of his more popular ones is the fires in structures under construction or renovation. Just came out in 2022. This is the scope of the issue. Figure average is about 4,300 construction fires a year, accounts for 5 civilian deaths. $376 million in property damage. Now the 4,300 construction site fires, that it sounds like a big number, and it is, but they only make up 1% of all fires that occur in the country. The fire problem in the United States still, and unfortunately probably always will be, 1 and 2 family dwellings. But these construction site fires do a disproportionate amount of damage. They get a disproportionate amount of press coverage because they're telegenic and they make for good video footage, and because they're over a long duration of time. It gives news crews a chance to get there and set up and all that stuff. And it also garners a lot of criticism. This is just a headline in Insurance Magazine, how they've been hammered by a rising fire and water damage claims. Now, the most often loss for insurance industry is water damage not from flooding. That makes up 1/3 of all insurance losses. Now, fires make up 1/12 of all the claims, but the payouts are 3 times larger. And this also plays into another problem because the water damage not from flooding makes the biggest loss for the insurance industry. They are raising their deductibles to mitigate their risk, and that is a disincentive for any builder to turn on the sprinkler system early. And you're going to see in some of these fires, I'm going to talk about the sprinkler system was operational, there was water available, and it wasn't turned on, and this is one of the reasons. I'm going to go over some significant fires that occurred during construction. The most recent is just last May 2023, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Okay, they had it was at 7741 Liberty Road Drive. This was 6-story mixed-use multifamily. It was 2 stories of concrete cast-in-place podium with 4-story lightweight wood above it. It started in a malfunction or alleged malfunction in a spray foam trailer. They had the spray foam trailer under the podium, and it caught fire. And unfortunately, it was right next to an elevator tower. So the hot smoking gas traveled right up the tower into every floor all at the same time. They were supposed to have a standpipe that went up with the building. This thing was 6 stories, so it was over the 40 stories that triggers the sprinkler system. I'm sorry, the standpipe system. And it was not in place. They had no pre-incident plan. There was no written plan as required by the code. There was delayed notification because there was no plan. Employees didn't know what to do. So they tried to fight the fire with these little extinguishers. There was also a delayed evacuation because there was no mass notification. There was no plan in place to notify folks. 2 workers on the 6th floor died in the fire. They actually were on Facebook Live asking for help, and nobody could get to them because they didn't know where they were. And there were 2 firefighter maydays that were really close calls that fortunately did not result in any firefighter fatalities. Bound Brook, New Jersey, back in 2020. Excuse me. This was also a podium construction project, 2 stories with 4 stories above it. Now, the interesting thing about this fire is in the bottom picture there, you see that big wide street, and on the left is where the Meridian Main was. That was an arson fire. The arsonist was caught within 3 hours because he was fortunate enough for he was nice enough to put on Facebook that he was going to light up downtown Bound Brook that day. They have video of him pushing the weighted base fence aside, going up to the 1st story of wood, which would have been the 3rd floor, and just by happenstance, there was a scrap room. They didn't have a dumpster, or they had dumpsters, but they piled scrap in this room, which you're not supposed to do. So it gave the arsonist all the fuel he needed in one room. This destroyed 4 surrounding buildings. They had to cut the power off to downtown Bound Brook for a day. It shut down a commuter rail line that went into Manhattan, and 100 homes had to be evacuated. Denver, Colorado. This was another outlier. This happened in the middle of the day, just like in Charlotte. They usually happen in off hours. 2 people died in this fire. Usually people don't die on these fires. The fatal 4 OSHA has identified is electrocutions, struck by hazards, caught between hazards, and fall from height. Injuries from fire and explosions is less than 2% of total job site injuries. The one thing about this fire, in addition to being an outlier because it happened in the middle of the afternoon and 2 people were killed, was that they had buildings in close proximity, and the incident commander knew that the subject building was gone, so she turned most of her water resources to the exposures and wound up saving the exposures. College Park, Maryland, they theorized that there was open shaft that people were throwing trash down, and someone threw a cigarette in there. It burned up in the open shaft into the roof. The local fire department didn't know the disposition of the standpipe system. They assumed that it was there, that it was fully operational. It wasn't, even though the code requires that it go up with the building. They had valves closed. The sprinkler system was installed, not yet operational, not turned on. This shut down the University of Maryland campus in College Park for a whole day. They had to evacuate some senior housing, and it just disrupted this entire community for over a day. Fairfax County, Virginia. This occurred on the weekend. The cause was a worker dropped a cigarette into a combustible garbage chute. They had a plastic combustible garbage chute on the exterior of the building. Dropped the cigarette down there, which caused the fire to spread rapidly back into the building. It wound up going to 5 alarms. Unfortunately, nobody was injured, but the building was a total loss. I put this one in here. This is a couple years ago, Oakland, California, to the Waverly. This was an undetermined fire, but they surmised that it was arson. The takeaway from this fire was they had a construction crane over top of the project, and the thermal column got so hot that the construction crane started to spin like a top, and the fire department had to pull back because of the collapse hazard. Now, I look at effective firefighting as a 3-legged stool. You need fire department access, you need water supply, and you need early notification. If you have fire department access but no water, it does you no good. If you have early notification but no fire department access, it does you no good. You need all 3 for the 3-legged stool to stand. So it's not a surprise to anyone that construction sites can be unsafe environments. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to construction sites. A lot of people doing their own thing. All the safety features aren't built in until the very end. There's also a lot of sources of fuel. You have combustible refuse and trash. You have building materials. You have flammable and combustible hazmat. You have packing materials. So this is a picture of the Hilton Tower in Columbus, Ohio, when it was under construction. It's been complete for 2 years now. This is a type 1 building, right? Non-combustible. Nothing can burn here. Nothing to see here. It's under construction, no problem. But when you walk around back, you see these temporary walls built into the back. So don't be fooled just because it's a type 1 building under construction. Even concrete cast in place construction uses wooden forms. Type 1 and type 2 buildings still have combustible contents. They still, vinyl tub kits, packaging. They still have hazmats and flammable combustible gases. So don't be fooled by the type of building that's being constructed. They had a fire actually in Brooklyn a couple years ago that was a concrete building and went to 6 alarms. It was under construction. There's also there's no shortage of ignition sources, smoky materials, cooking, open flames, electrical, that kind of thing. So you want to try to segregate the sources of ignition from the sources of fuel. So this is just a video from that same tower that I showed you, the Hilton Tower in Columbus. I was walking in from dinner and I saw a guy doing hot work, welding to be specific. No fire watch. It's completely dark up there. You're going to see that slag back bouncing off the side of the building, going God knows where. Fortunately, it didn't cause a fire, but I do like to show this. Sorry for the grade. It was my telephone I recorded this with. I didn't have anything better than that at the time. It was dark. But you can see that slag bouncing off the side of the building. If it were to fall into a crevice where there's combustible dust or combustible material, you're going to get a fire from that. So this is just sort of the Dangerous practices that you see every day on construction sites if they're not tightly regulated or if there's not a culture of safety within that job site. So here are the causes of new construction fires. Some people are surprised that cooking equipment is the top cause. Electrical's number two. Heating equipment intentionally set fires. But you have to look behind the numbers. That's the leading causes. You look behind the numbers. Cooking fires, while they make up 19%, they only are responsible for, you know, 2% of all the property damage. They're usually small and minor in nature. Where electrical fires and intentionally set fires combined make up about 26% of all fire causes, they're responsible for almost 75% of the property loss. So just seeing the raw percentages doesn't really tell the whole story. So yeah, cooking is an issue, but they usually don't cause big fires, where electrical fires and intentionally set fires cause big losses. We also know that they occur more frequently in colder months. Peak times between noon and 9. 18% occur between midnight and 4. But those fires do a third of the property damage. Or I'm sorry, they do 53% of the property damage. 18% of the fires occur between midnight and 4, but they're accountable for more than half of the total property damage. So the property uses for these buildings being constructed, overwhelmingly residential buildings uh, burn more frequently than other occupancy types or property uses when it comes to construction sites. And these are some leading factors contributing to ignition: electrical malfunctions, abandoned discarded materials, and heat sources too close to combustibles. They had a fire up in Massachusetts several years ago. They were testing an emergency generator. They had trash and debris around it. They left it unattended, and it caught the trash and debris on fire, and it was a several alarm fire and a total loss. Brings us to our second polling question. What is the leading cause of fires in building under construction? What is the leading cause of fires in buildings under construction? Cooking equipment. Cooking equipment is the number one cause of fires on construction sites. Now we're going to talk about the codes and standards and roles and responsibility when it comes to keeping construction sites fire safe. Now, a lot of folks don't realize that there are codes that specifically govern job sites, construction sites. I think too often those in the fire service and the building department, and I was in both, think that, oh, it's a temporary situation, it's under construction, they get a free pass when it comes to code requirements. But you don't get a free pass. These are the codes that apply. If you're an IFC jurisdiction, it's Chapter 33. If you are an NFPA jurisdiction, it is Chapter 16. But the grandfather of all of these construction fire safety codes is the NFPA Standard 241. This was adopted back in 1933, so it's not a new standard by any stretch. It is also not a very long standard. It's less than 30 pages, including the appendices. And even if you're not an NFPA jurisdiction, let's say you're an IFC jurisdiction, in Chapter 33 of the IFC, it references 241. It basically says if there's anything that's not covered in here that is covered in 241, you still have to do it. So if you've adopted the IFC, then you have adopted 241 by reference in your jurisdiction. Now, there's a lot of responsibility to go around, but it starts and stops with the owner. They have a responsibility to keep a safe work environment. They have a responsibility to have a management policy, to work closely with the AHJ on a plan and processes for hot work and those kind of things. The culture of fire safety starts at the top. Now, I'm not going to read off every slide, but I'm going to read off of this one because it's important. It says in NFPA 241, a fire safety program shall be included in all contracts, all construction, alteration, and demolition contracts. And it is the right of the owner to administer and enforce this program, even if it is entirely under the jurisdiction of the contractor. So the owner, if they're not going to do it themselves, have to designate someone to be in charge of this program. And even if they do delegate that responsibility to someone else, they can't delegate the accountability. So if they are if they are code violations, it goes to the owner, even if the GC is completely in charge of it. Now, when it comes to fire safety program, it doesn't say included in all big construction, alteration, or demolition contracts. It says all. So in theory, if John Q. Public was going to remodel his kitchen, he would need a fire safety program. Now, this can be scoped any way you want it. It could be a one-pager for something like that. But according to NFPA 241, there is supposed to be a program for all. And a program manager, the fire prevention program manager, who the owner designates if they don't act in that position, they have responsibilities. They have responsibility to make sure their crews are trained on fire protection equipment like extinguishers, develop a pre-fire plan with the local fire department, make sure there's adequate fire protection devices, which would be extinguishers, supervision of and permanent hot work. In NFPA 241, there is a weekly self-inspection requirement. In the IFC, it is a daily self-inspection requirement. They have to authorize plan impairments and mitigate those impairments. If there's going to be a hydrant that goes down, they have to mitigate that loss of water either with a water truck or some other means. And they're also responsible for the guard service. Employees have responsibility to report all fire hazards, to observe safety rules, and to use tools safely and wear their personal protective equipment as provided and required. And even job sites have even job site visitors have responsibility to wear appropriate PPE, to stay visible and stay alert, not parking vehicles in a way that would block fire department access. Now I'm going to get to the authority having jurisdiction's responsibility, and it is a team that has responsibilities. And part of that team is the building department. They're going to go on the job site and they're going to, look at the approved plans, and they're going to apply MEP codes. Fire Prevention Bureau, some do it, some don't. They go out and do pump tests. They go out on job sites, do hydros, maybe bulk feed inspections. And then the Fire Suppression Division, the local firehouses, should be developing a pre-fire plan if this construction site catches on fire. They need to assess the water supply, the access, more importantly, the exposure protection from surrounding buildings. So there is a lot of responsibility to go around. But the problem is that building inspectors and fire inspectors, when they look at construction fire safety, they look at it from the lens of their traditional roles. And what I mean by that is, when I was in the building department, we looked at construction fire safety as a fire department function, fire marshal function. Hey, we go on site, we look at the approved plans, we make sure they're built according to the approved plans, and we apply, the mechanical code, electrical code, plumbing code, that kind of thing. Fire, that's in the fire code. That's the fire guys. Now, the fire inspector, in their traditional role, they say, wait. We basically inspect finished buildings or nearly finished buildings. Most of the time when the fire marshals come out, late in the game, it's the fire pump test. It's the sprinkler, inspections and that kind of stuff. So they don't really get out there to the end of the process. And they're saying, it's the building department's responsibility to enforce that. So you have the building inspectors thinking it's the fire inspectors. You have the fire inspectors thinking it's the building inspectors. And neither side is doing it to be negligent or lazy. It's just their traditional roles and how they were raised. And I've been on both sides, and I've seen it, and probably been guilty of it. But that's why I always throw that in this class to build awareness, because it is a problem when the AHJs don't talk to each other, and the bad practices, like you saw that person welding in that tall building, that occurs in that gap, the responsibility gap, I call it. So, okay. Polling question 3: which code does not safeguard structures under construction? NFPA 241, IBC Chapter 33, IFC Chapter 33, NFPA 1 Chapter 16, or E, none of the above? None of the above. All of these have to do with construction safety. IBC Chapter 33 really doesn't deal with fire safety. It deals with other kind of safety on the job sites, like protective walkways, but it does reference IFC Chapter 33. So we're going to talk about fire safety program, construction site safety plans. And a good plan should address all of the following. I'm not going to read all these because we're going to talk about each one individually. And we're going to talk about good housekeeping. One, I want to jump down to consider special hazards. What do I mean by special hazards? Well, I was part of the building of a power plant in Prince George's County, Maryland. And the power plants, they always have a turbine or they have a switch yard. And the switch yard gets energized before the plant even comes online. And there's outbuildings in the switch yard. So we had to have a special plan to shut down the switch yard if any of the buildings caught fire, because no one could enter the switch yard unless it was de-energized. So I assure you that was not like flipping a light switch off. The switch yard sent power to Central Maryland, Southern Maryland, DC, and you just couldn't shut it off on the blink of an eye. So we had to develop a plan. That's what I mean by consider special hazards. Now they're saying that the plan is right out of NFPA 241 and IFC, should include the organizational structure and responsibilities for fire safety. Okay, you want to know who answers to who and who do you go to when it is a problem. You want the name and contact number for the person responsible for fire protection, fire prevention compliance. You don't want to be there 3 o'clock in the morning when something's gone wrong and try to get somebody's name or number to get somebody out there with the keys. You want the plan should arrange for recording of fire safety training. Now, risk assessment and FPE reports requiring specific fire safety measures. Now, would you need an FPE to do a fire safety plan for a small tenant fit out? No. This code says you can require it, but this is a little bit of an onerous requirement for a small project or somebody's building a deck on the back of their house. But if you had a complex structure like a hospital, or you had something that's important to the community like a school or any kind of big building, it would probably be a good idea to get an FPE risk assessment. You make sure the fire safety requirements are in compliance with the codes, of course. And then procedures for emergency notifications. And I think that's important because a lot of times we overestimate the fire safety literacy of the public. For anybody who's been in been a first responder or been involved in public safety, it's just like a no-brainer. You call 911. Doesn't everybody know that? Well, no, everybody doesn't know that. There is a cultural shift in the workforce in the construction industry. And many of these folks do not speak English as a first language. It's English as a second language, number one. Number two, where they came from didn't have fire prevention week in their school system. They might not even had 911 systems. And just from a cultural point of view, they came from places where when you have a problem, you don't call the government. I'll give you a prime example from construction fire in New Jersey a couple years ago. Some workers were doing unpermitted hot work in a wall cavity. So they heard crackling. Did they report it to anybody? No, they went to lunch. So when they get back, they smell smoke. Do they call 911? No. They call their boss, who doesn't answer the first time. The fire department was actually notified because it was burning in this concealed space and burned through a plastic sprinkler pipe, which set off a water flow alarm. So it wasted an enormous amount of time. It would have been a small fire had they been properly notified, the fire service. It became a huge fire. And here's some other things I'm going to talk about each of these at length, so I don't need to really list them right now. Fire protection provisions, things like fire extinguishers, standpipes. A lot of these don't come online until much later in the process. So you're not going to be able to count on fire sprinklers to put out your fire. You're not going to be able to count on fire alarm and early detection unless you make special provisions for it. And if you're in the wildland urban interface, you want to make sure that the clearances are maintained. You trim back the bushes. And then separation from adjacent buildings and other hazards. What is that? It's phased occupancy. Phased occupancy. No, it usually occurs in apartment buildings and it occurs in hotels because no owner wants to wait until the very last unit is done to be able to occupy, rent out, make some money on these things. There's no provisions in the code for phased occupancy. It doesn't tell you how. So everybody has to figure it out for themselves. When I was in Baltimore City, we used to allow phased occupancies, but that entire zone that was going to be occupied, all the fire protection equipment had to work, sprinklers, notification, the whole nine, and you'd have 1 hour separation from the construction. That was just something that we did, but there's no no cookie cutter approach to it. It's really site specific. Best practices and code requirements. So site security is emerging as an important topic. Before, NFPA and IFC used to say the guard service is only required when the AHJ requests it. Security fences should be provided where required by the AHJ. Entrances of the structure must be secured where required. So the default is you don't need it unless the AHJ says you need it. Well, LA City reversed those defaults, and they say the guard service and the security fence are required unless we tell you you don't need them. And there's a new provision in NFPA 241 2019 edition that says if you go above 40 feet, then you need a guard service. But you don't need the guard service 24/7. You only need it when work isn't being done off hours. And I'll go more into that later. But there should be a site security plan based on observations and that kind of thing. The guard service should be trained in notification. Everybody has a phone, right? Function and operation of fire protection equipment, extinguishers. So when I talk about extinguishers, I talk about training, and part of the training of using fire extinguishers is when not to use them. Because if you try to put the fire out with extinguishers and it doesn't work, you've wasted time in notifying 911. The fire in College Park, Maryland that I talked about, state fire marshal told me they found 12 expended extinguishers at the area of origin. So that means They wasted time to expel 12 extinguishers. The fire in Charlotte, instead of calling 911, they tried to put it out with extinguishers when this trailer was fully involved in fire. No chance of extinguishers putting that out, especially the size extinguishers they had. They didn't notify 911 for 9-10 minutes into that fire after they discovered it. Another thing that's out of the box thinking when it comes to the site security plan is consider the opioid epidemic in this country. Avalon Bay, a national builder, as part of their site security assessment, they look at the CDC map in the CDC in Atlanta. They have a opioid addiction map, and they add that as a risk factor in determining the level of security on a particular job site. This is just a stat. 2020, there were 24 major multifamily construction fires. 16 were reported as suspicious. And I always say they always put up a fence after the fire. I don't get it. Here, this is a fire in a garden apartment, Long Neck, Delaware, and I was there as it was still smoldering. And the fire marshal told me that someone or more than one person came out of that tree line behind that building, went into the back, and started a fire. Now, what was it for warmth? Was it for food? Was it to cook drugs? Was it to burn insulation off a copper wire so they could steal it? Who knows? But there were two other garden apartments on either side of that that didn't burn, and they were putting up the fence on that one. And I said, when are you fencing off the other two? And the guy said, well, they didn't catch fire. And I said, well, do you want them to? You know, you already had a security issue with that one that started for a fire. So sometimes it's hard to convince corporate leadership of the critical importance of perimeter security. You know, it costs them a little extra money. They feel that, you know, it messes with their site logistics and that kind of thing. But because of the emerging trend of potentially set fires, that needs to be addressed. Some areas, you know, in urban areas, it's a challenge to put a fence around a building because it's an infill lot. So I get it. And there's some final thoughts on security. You know, artificial fence line monitoring is a good thing, video security and signs up. That picture is actually one of the garden apartments that didn't burn. That's what like that other garden apartment that did burn looked like before the fire. Oh, there should be separation distances. 241 is not highly technical. I think this is the only table in the whole standard. And I just pulled an example from the table. And so it says if you have 20 feet of temporary structure exposing wall length, you would need to be at least 30 feet away from the building under construction, but you get a 75% reduction if the temporary building is sprinklered. Housekeeping. When I say housekeeping rules are not the same as housekeeping activity, you can have all the rules in the world. If it is not enforced, it can go south really quick. The construction managers don't get bonuses on how clean they keep a construction site. They get bonuses on getting done under budget, getting done on time, getting done early. So they want all hands, you know, swinging hammers or doing something. And a lot of times housekeeping goes by the wayside. And to give you an example from my personal life, I was renovating my house in South Baltimore, and I pulled down an old duck, and it had a KFC bag in it and a Taco Bell bag in it. Now, I didn't put it there. So I surmised that the last people who did the renovation probably weren't homeowners. They were eating lunch and just shoved it in the duck. Okay, and that's just a little row house in South Baltimore. Imagine a big construction site where these guys only get 30 minutes for lunch. Do you think they're going to look around for a trash can? They're going to shove it down a shaft like they did in College Park. And unfortunately, that's the same place people stick their cigarettes when they don't want to get caught smoking illegally on job sites. Housekeeping is very important. They're supposed to clear the premises of all refuse and processed waste on a daily basis. You know, keep the area free of accumulated packing materials. Provide appropriate metal bins or dumpsters with tight-fitting lids. You know, don't have a scrap room like they had in Downbrook, New Jersey. It's really common sensical kind of stuff. If you have storage, you want to make cut aisles in it between the storage so firefighters can get between. So there's not these big long uh, piles of building materials. If you have the sprinkler system installed, you want to make sure they don't impede with the effective sprinkler operations. And you want to pull that dumpster. Now it says 35 feet away from combustible structures. Info lots, you're not going to be able to do it. LA City says pull it away as far as you can. It's practical. But with sprinkler systems, we had a hotel in College Park that was almost done, and they put 500 mattresses in their basement, completely blocked the sprinkler system. Had it caught fire, it would have been a big time problem. I just want to let you know that there's a standard for hot work, and it's 51B. I'm not going to go into the standard, but just let you know there is a standard. And there's certain hot work definitions. I think everybody on this call would know what hot work is. We have designated areas and permit required areas. Designated areas are areas like machine shops, places that were meant to do hot work. Permit required areas are everywhere else. When I say permit required, I don't mean permit like the AHJ or the city offers you a permit or issues you a permit. This is an internal process within the construction company. So you would have somebody who's in charge of authorizing hot work. They call them the permit authorizing individual. That individual, if a subcontractor wanted to do hot work, they'd have to go to that individual and get a permit authorizing it. Okay. There is actually one jurisdiction in the country where you do get the permits from the AHJ, and that is in Boston and Massachusetts. They have a whole hot work program that's administered by the fire departments of the state and of Boston. I don't know of any other place, but there is on NFPA's website a whole thing on the program and how it should operate. So these are just standard examples of hot work. So it should be closely controlled. You know, if I go to you asking for a permit, I have to give you an application or whatever mechanism to let the permit authorizing individual know when the hot work is going to be. Okay, we're going to have hot work. It's going to be on December the 8th from 11 to 3. You got to let them know where in very specific terms. Okay, it's going to be in the third level of stairwell A. And you got to let them know what. We're going to be welding handrails or steps. So the person who authorized it would give them a permit. They'd go out ahead of time, maybe 30 minutes early, and they would make sure there's no combustibles around. They'd make sure that it was free of combustibles. It reinforces accountability to the construction site itself when they do that. They want to make sure the combustibles are 35 feet away. There's no hazmats around that could catch fire. Anything that can't be moved could be covered with, these blankets that are fireproof. So after the hot work is completed, they also go back and make sure that the fire watch is in place, and they keep all the paths clear and it's reasonably clean. Now, the fire watch for hot work, not to be confused with the guard service fire watch, the fire watch for hot work, the person can have no other duties. They're supposed to be standing there watching the person do the hot work, looking for where the slag goes. They're next to an extinguisher if something catches on fire, and they're supposed to stay there for 30 minutes after hot work ceases. And for a torch applied roof system, it's supposed to be an hour. I told you, construction managers hate people standing around. So they want, can't you sweep up or do this or that while you're doing the fire watch? According to code, no. If they really hate that, they really are going to hate that they stand around for 30 minutes afterwards. But with torch applied roof system, it's longer because rubber roofs have been a problem. People have those big rubber roofs and they're on rolls, and They're supposed to cut it, heat it, then apply it, but nobody ever does it that way. They always roll it out and they take that torch right along where the rubber meets the roof. And if it's a plywood roof deck, you could have, you know, a combust. You could have dust or sawdust or something catch an ember. They cover it right over so they don't even see that something caught. And then 3 o'clock in the morning, it's just smoldering all night. The fire department's back for a roof fire. Some places have gotten innovative and they use thermal imaging cameras after hot work to make sure there's no hot spots. Now, the other area where I believe that regulators get it a little wrong is for electrical temporary wiring. People think, oh, it's only temporary. You know, there's no codes that govern that. It's only temporary. It's not going to be there long. They don't get a mulligan. There are requirements for temporary wiring. One, all branch circuits have to originate in an approved power outlet or panel board. Every conductor has to be protected with overcurrent devices. Runs of wire have to be supported and fastened at intervals of no less than 10 feet. I think the NEC requires 8 feet for finished wire. Electrical devices should be maintained in a safe condition. Electrical extension cords shall be maintained free of damage. How many times on a construction site do you see electrical extension cords that have been cut and they just tape them up because they don't want to pay $80 for an extension cord? And any kind of damaged equipment should be removed from service until it's fixed or replaced. But they do have codes that govern temporary electric. Temporary lighting should be equipped with guards. They shouldn't be dangled by their cord or suspended by their cord unless they're designed that way. And all temporary wiring and lights should be removed upon the completion of construction. So here's some electrical code violations that I saw on a construction site up in Jersey. That picture to your left, does that look like that branch circuit is originating in a panel board? No, they tapped off the outlet. And on the other picture, you see a couple things. One, the wire's dangling unsupported until it's open splices. Splices are supposed to occur in junction boxes or conduit. Now, smoking, there's actually two schools of thought for smoking. You can either prohibit it completely or you can designate an area and regulate it. I'm more in that camp because people are going to smoke. The pictures there, I couldn't fit both in the same picture. There's a no smoking sign, and right beneath it are 3 cigarette butts and a pack of cigarettes. So just putting up signage isn't enough. Okay, poll question. For torch-applied roofing systems, how long must the fire watch remain after work ends? Two hours for torch-applied roof system. 2 hours, according to the latest edition of PA. Cooking, I told you there's been a cultural change in the workforce. So a lot of the folks that are on job sites don't want to go out and pay for their food. They want to cook it right there, either a hibachi or a hot plate or some other kind of open flame, a grill. And it's the leading cause of construction site fires, even though they're minor. It still does a third of all the civilian damages on construction sites when it comes to burns. So you'd want to designate a place and have plenty of signage. Now, here's just some best practice. No vehicle should be parked inside the building unless fire detection systems are installed and monitored. In Charlotte, it had the spray foam trailer parked underneath the podium inside the building, right next to basically a shaft. You want to make sure equipment is cooled down when you're refueling it. You want to make sure there's policies for cleaning spills and that kind of thing. And fuel storage and surface areas should not be located within structures under construction. The fire in Denver that killed the 2 workers, they think they couldn't prove it, but they think they were improperly refueling equipment, and that's how the fire started and spread so quickly. Waste materials, there should be scheduled delivery as close to installation as possible. Everything should be kept clean. You want to cut back the vegetation 60 feet if you can, and prohibit open fires. You see that burn? You see these burn barrels in the wintertime to stay warm, but also builders like to burn waste because it's the less they have to take to the dump. Heating equipment, this should be attended. I will tell you a story about Rockville, Maryland, about a heater caused a big fire there. It's supposed to be attended, and if it's not attended, it's supposed to be turned off. It should be 36 inches of clearance from any combustible material. If there's any damage to it, it should be taken off immediately, and it should be secured against getting knocked over. Now, combustible material storage, they say should be at least 30 feet away from the building, if that's possible. Sometimes builders want to store it in garages, because usually if the big building with a parking garage, the parking garage gets built first, so they want to store everything in there. You're going to be limited by your lot size on how far away you can store any kind of combustible materials. In that picture, you see them storing parallel cord truss more than 30 feet away from the subject buildings. That's an example of good storage, but they had a big lot. Uh, for buildings 4 stories or more where there's an exposed facade, combustible, or construction is predominantly combustible, it's a good idea. It's not required by the code, and that it be progressively clad as it goes up. And if the sprinkler system's provided, if it can, because of the weather, it should be progressively commissioned as the system goes in. That's a whole other issue about sprinklers and when to turn them on. A lot of people disagree on a lot of things, so I'll just leave that there. But here's a picture of um, podium construction, and the whiteboard you see is non-combustible cladding going up with the building. And the orange wood compared to the tan wood is fire retardant treated wood, and you see a good perimeter fence there with the Jersey wall. So this is a site that went above the code because they're really serious about site security and construction fire safety. Now, the only place in the code that says that a building has to be progressively cladded as it goes up is tall mass timber buildings, CLT buildings. They have to be progressively cladded as they go up. I'll talk about that a little later. Now, for passive systems, you cannot rely on those because they're usually don't go in until very, very late in the process. And even when the gyp board gets up, a lot of times they don't like putting the fire doors on because workers will kick them open and they'll get dinged up and they want them nice and neat. But if you're going to, and Jersey played around with the idea of if you're going to put a fire barrier up, you have to construct the entire barrier, even if you're not framing out the rest of the building. That's a hard one to pass because a lot of builders are like, you're messing up my schedule, my construction schedule. I want to bring the sheetrock folks in when they can do the whole room, not just one wall. That's a challenge. This is if you're going to require temporary separation walls. This is how you do it. At least 1 hour fire resistance rating, and opening should have a 45-minute protection rating. But like I said, not required by the code. The other thing is when the storage of flammable liquids and gases. Once again, this is an area because it's only temporary that people think they get a mulligan. You don't. You still have to store them in accordance with NFPA standards. All NFPA standards still apply. And I just listed a couple of the more popular standards there in the code that have to apply to proper storage of hazmats. Gas line purging, I just want to let you know there's a standard on gas line purging for when you're demoing a place. Almost every jurisdiction I've worked in has had a natural gas incident because of failure to purge the gas line properly. With flammable liquids, you want to make sure your workers are trained in the storage and handling. You want to try to keep the supply down to a couple days and also provide clear signage. Now, this is an example of not proper storage. You have mineral spirits, which is highly flammable. They lost the cap, so they put a glove and a napkin in there act as a cap, which really creates a wick. It's on an OSB temporary table next to combustible box. So this is an example of how not to do it. And these are also things just to deal with leakage and spillage promptly. You want to segregate liquids and gases from material that can intensify the fire, like oxygen. Liquids may only be used for their intended purpose. What should that mean? Well, does anybody have a grandfather or uncle who used to clean car parts with gasoline? Well, that's not the intended purpose of gasoline. And at firehouse I used to work at, we used to clean axe heads with gasoline. But it's supposed to be used for their intended purposes, not other things. I talked about garbage chutes when I talked about the fire in Fairfax. If you have a combustible garbage chute, it has to be located outside the building. And most importantly, you have to have a recessed sprinkler head near the top of the chute. Now, the all these chutes come with the recess, but they don't necessarily come with the fire head, the sprinkler head. And in Fairfax, it did not have a sprinkler head, and the whole building burned pretty quickly because it burned up that chute right into a unit and went to town. Built-in fire protection features, they're usually, not effective until they're complete. A lot of times you only have one set of stairs that include fire-resistant walls. Intermezzo's usually aren't put on structural steel to the end. And then sprinkler systems and detection systems don't really come online to the end. Now, there is a new provision in NFPA 241 that says during construction, a suitable location has to be designated for the command post. And it's supposed to have plans in there, emergency info, keys, anything that you need should be in there. And the person in charge of fire protection to the site should know to respond to that location if an emergency occurs. Yeah, so it's a key box provision. If you lock anything down, you have to have a key box. That's an example of a Knox box, and all the keys to get access to all areas of the construction site have to be in there. Now, for firefighting access, the exterior, you should have an accessible road with an all-weather driving surface at least 20 feet of obstructed width. So that means you can't have 20 feet then park vehicles on it. It has to be 20 feet of unobstructed width and 13 and a half feet of unobstructed height, by the way. They have to be within 150 feet of the first floor exterior walls where you can. A lot of times you can't. And dead end roads have to have a turnaround 150 feet. Now, all-weather driving surface, crush and run, gravel, that kind of thing. Because builders are always putting the curb and gutter first, but they won't put the overlay on until it's done because they want their construction vehicles tearing it up. So they have a crush and run. And there was an incident in West Des Moines, Iowa, where they had a crush and run road down, and the builder said to the fire marshal, "Hey, I got concrete trucks coming on Monday. Can I have them take all the gravel up so when they get here early Monday, we can lay the concrete down right away?" And the fire marshal, being a nice guy, says, "Yeah." Well, it rained all weekend. Rained all weekend, and it was muddy, and there was a fire, and they couldn't get within 1,000 feet of the place. Firefighters couldn't because they sank down the axles in mud, and the building was pretty much a loss. They couldn't get there. Now, firefighting access with stairs. Now, the code only requires one usable stairway that goes up with the building at all times, just one. And this building design down there, Texas Donut, all you need is one stairway. But what if the fire occurs at the other end? But you only required one. It has to be lighted. It has to be there has to be signage on the floor level and stair designation, and that kind of thing. In Charlotte, the two construction workers that were lost were on the 6th level, which was the top level, and they were far away from the one stairwell that they had as you could get, and that building was a quarter mile long, so that really it prevented their safe escape from the building. And you want to make sure that there's access to hydrants. Here they got a roll top a dumpster put in front of a hydrant. You're not going to really be able to hook up to that if you had to. Standpipes are probably the most important fire protection system in a building under construction before the sprinkler systems come online. It's the quickest and most effective way to convey water to upper floors. Okay, so the code says once it hits 40 feet, you have to have a standpipe in place that goes up with the building one floor below the floor of active construction. Okay, you have to have an FDC, fire department connection, which is conspicuously marked and readily accessible. And IFC provides that you need to have a minimum fire flow of 500 gallons per minute. In this picture, you're not supposed to have debris in there at any time, really. But in Charlotte, they didn't have any fire sprinkler a standpipe. And I saw the video and I heard the tapes of firefighters with high-rise pack going in, being ordered to hook up to the standpipe, and them saying there is no standpipe, so they had to back out and then stretch lines. Now, NFPA 241 just says you have to have an adequate water supply whenever combustibles get on site, but they don't tell you any guidance on what that supply is, was adequate. Now, the ISC just recently in the last edition provided some fire flow requirements. So part of it is based on the proximity to adjacent structures. So if you are within 30 feet of an adjacent lot line or a structure, you have to have 100% of the fire flow of the completed building or 500 gallons per minute, whatever is greater. If it's 30 to 60 feet, it's half of the fire flow of the completed building or 500 gallons a minute, whatever's greater. And if it's more than 60 feet, you just have to have 500 gallons a minute. So it gives you a little bit of guidance. Now, is 500 gallons a minute adequate? This one local interpretation says you have to have 1,500 gallons a minute. This is a local interpretation I plucked off the internet. But give a little case study. In Rockville, there was a 4-story building under construction. What had happened was a heater was left on all weekend. So we had a heater issue. It was all this combustible trash in the upper floor in the same room as the heater that kept running and running and running. And it caught the debris on fire and it burned up into the roof. And the thing had been running all weekend long. It had a guard service. The guard service didn't patrol. He just sat in their booth the whole time. And it burned into the roof. Good news. There's a sprinkler system. Bad news. It was not turned on because it was an extraordinarily cold March, and they didn't want to risk water damage. So all those master streams are throwing anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 gallons a minute. I don't know how many jurisdictions can generate that type of fire flow, but it was certainly way more than 500 gallons a minute. So, polling question. Fire access roads must be at least how many feet of unobstructed width? Okay, fire access roads have to be how many feet of unobstructed width? And the answer is 20 feet. Now, Avalon Bay, they created a fire elimination plan that goes above what the code requires. So they're every site that they can fence off, they fence off, and they have badge in and badge out. They try to limit the sources of ignition. So they do bolt-on stairs instead of welded stairs. They do pressure fittings instead of braze fittings where the code allows it. They do hot work. They try to do as much of it off-site and bring it on to assemble it. And they also have early detection. And part of that, this is above what the code requires. They have Wi-Fi enabled remote sensors. And because they're Wi-Fi and they work off of batteries, you don't have to, run a lot of wires. You can, some of them are hardwired, but they can be used from job to job to job. They collect many channels of data, including heat rate of rise, smoke, that kind of thing. And because they're Wi-Fi enabled, that information can be sent to any electronic device. It could be the job site manager, it could be 911, but it would help with early detection, but that is above what the code requires. So there are new construction safety code provisions in 241. It has definitions. It has electrical service disconnecting means requirement, guard service requirement, I talked about a little bit, command post and key box requirement I talked about. And in the 2021 IBC, there was a family of code provisions that were passed that allow for tall mass timber buildings. So because they're new to the code, NFPA 241 committee thought they might need some special construction requirements. So it has definitions, and since cross-laminated timber is the #1 building material used in tall mass timber buildings, they needed a definition for it. So you get that. Definition for critical heat flux as well, because that plays into some requirements. So just like in anyone's house, when there's a fire, some fire companies are assigned to shut off the utilities. You don't want to be throwing water around live electrical services. So during construction, you have to have a single switch that shuts off all of the electric to the whole project. Yeah, that's why every branch circuit has to originate in a panel board or power outlet. This is a guard service requirement. I talked about it before. If you go above 40 feet, and in the ISC, it's if you go above 40 feet or 50,000 square feet of aggregate floor area, you have to have a guard service when there's no crews on site. And they actually have an NFPA standard for guard service requirements. I talked about the command post and the key box provisions. No sense in going back over that. That's just the words of code. Now, for mass timber building construction requirements, you have to have what they call a fire exposure analysis. So I got calls. What is that? It's basically a risk assessment, and you look for certain things, and then based on that risk assessment, the person conducting it, which would be a design professional, would either require or not require additional safeguards depending on the outcome of the risk assessment. And this is just talking about the analysis could consider the maximum number of stories that would not yet have passive or active fire protection installed, separation distances, and this is where the critical heat flux comes in that will cause ignition or cause windows to fail on the exposures around it. That's some of it. This is just how Massachusetts views the fire exposure analysis. It gives you 6 means that you should consider: the size of the building under construction, the method, materials, and sequencing of construction, proximity to adjacent structures, means of egress, active and fire protection systems, and then the responding fire department capabilities. Because there is such a disparity between fire departments in this country when it comes to size and resources and capabilities. So if you had a big multifamily that was going in a small community that say had a little fire department, and you might want to build additional safeguards after you do your analysis. And these are some of the mass timber requirements. One is you have to have a minimum 6-foot high security fence around the entire exterior of the construction site, and you also have a guard service once it exceeds 3 stories and workers are not on site. Now the ISC has some new requirements as well. These are some of the requirements: the daily fire and safety inspection I talked about a little bit, fire watch requirements, cooking separation, site safety plan. See, in NFPA 241, they call it the fire prevention program. In the ISC, it's called the site safety plan. In the IFC, the person in charge of that is the site safety director. In NFPA 241 is the fire prevention program manager. I don't know why they don't try to get those titles together, but they don't. And then they added tall mass timber fire safety requirements as well. Now, I think the biggest change is the requirement of the fire safety the daily fire safety inspection. It requires the site safety director or designee to conduct a daily fire safety inspection at their project site. Okay, it has to be done every day. It has to be done every day until the certificate of occupancy is issued. And if these inspection reports are requested by the fire official and you fail to give it to them after 3 times, the fire official can issue a stop work order. And that's important because a lot of times fire officials can't issue stop work orders. They have to come from the building side. And I can assure you, stop work orders are the best tool in the toolbox for getting compliance. So these are some of the areas that you have to look at every day. And you do a 360 around your job site and you walk every floor. Unless it's humongous, it shouldn't really take that long. And I'm not going to go over these because we talked about every one of these. These are in the code of requirements of daily self-inspection. You can see that hydrants are clearly visible. You have extinguishers are in service and properly spaced. The standpipes going up. Fire department access isn't obstructed. This is the fire watch requirement for the guard service requirement for the IFC. So it goes above 40 feet in height or 50,000 square feet. Now, I want to go back to that daily self-inspection. Uh, I think you might get pushback on some folks because they're like, oh, it's too hard, it's too cumbersome, it's too onerous. The American Wood Council, through the Construction Fire Safety Coalition, has developed an app. It'll probably go live next month. It's not live right this minute, but it will be on their website. And this is an app where you can download it to any tablet or any phone or any device. And it basically is an electronic checklist of everything that the IFC requires to be inspected every day. And you go through these checklists and you just answer the questions. They're either yes or no questions or compliant, not compliant questions until you get to the very end. Then you sign it and you hit submit. And when you hit submit, it generates a PDF. Now you could keep that PDF on your phone. You could print it out and put it in a file, or you could email it or text it to anyone. So that should make it a lot easier to for the person's building and the regulators to require documentation of this daily fire safety inspection. So we're real excited about that going online, and we're hoping that it really has impact in these inspections being done and being documented. So the guard service fire watch, not to be confused from the hot work fire watch, they are allowed to serve as security. They're allowed to have other duties. They're to be trained in the use of fire extinguishers and fire reporting, what we talked about. They should have at least one means of notifying the fire department, who doesn't have a cell phone nowadays. And they have to keep a log of their patrols. I told you in Rockville, they had a guard, but they just sat in the booth the whole time. Had they patrolled like they're supposed to, they'd have found that there was a heater on and could have turned it off before it caught the combustibles on fire, but they didn't. And some places I know of, they actually take stickers with barcodes on it, and the guard will have to go around and scan every ticket, these stickers around the building, so that way they know that they patrolled. It's a way to make them accountable. Cooking separation, the requirement is at least 10 feet from combustible materials with signage designating cooking area, and then cooking outside that area would be prohibited. The site safety plan requirement. Now, this is another great change. The site safety plan is now required and must be submitted prior to the issuance of a building permit. Okay. Once a builder gets a building permit and puts shovels in the dirt, it's really hard to get anything out of them documentation wise. This says you can't get a building permit unless you submit a fire safety plan or site safety plan with the original submittal. Now, unfortunately, North Carolina amended this to say the site safety plan is now required. It must be submitted prior to the start of construction, which is how it used to be. And it's a very big difference between before a building permit is issued and before construction for those reasons. So it was unfortunate North Carolina decided to do that. But I hope a lot of jurisdictions don't amend this out of the code, because to get that site safety plan, and the site safety plan is not some document you just pay for and you sit on a wall. It's a living document. It should change as the building changes, because the building material storage changes during the course of a job. A lot of things change during the course of a job. And here's things the site safety plan needs to include. I went over these for the most part. Hot work provision changes that affect the plan. What changes could affect the plan? Time of year. If I'm building a hotel in Ocean City, Maryland, it's going to be a very different experience in February than it would be in July. So that's a change that could affect the plan. Now, there's a site safety director training requirement in both NFPA and in in IFC. All the code says, the code's famous for giving you a requirement, but then making them totally vague. So it just says that the site safety director must have qualifications specific to their roles and responsibility. That's all it says. And does that mean that you have to be a fire inspector 1? Does that mean you have to have fire service experience? Does that mean that you took this class? Well, nobody knows. It's up whatever the authority having jurisdiction requires. But I can tell you that the National Association of State Fire Marshals have put together a wonderful program, and they're trying to put it online that construction managers can go to go through the self-paced internet course that covers everything I covered and more. And then you get a certificate at the end once you pass a small test, and that could be the documentation that you have training. It's very similar to what they did several years ago when there was a crowd manager requirement put into the code when it came to public assemblies, and those people had to be trained. So I'm looking forward to that getting up online. Uh, and between that and the fire safety, construction fire safety app, I think we could really make it easier at construction sites to comply with these roles. And here are the duties of the fire safety directors on site. And like I said, all these I've talked about, and no sense in going back over them again. Now there is tall mass timber construction fire safety requirements. Okay, the water supply has to be approved for fire department operations by the fire chief or fire official, and the where the building exceeds 6 stories grade plane, the non-combustible protection on the outside and where required on the inside has to go up with the building, and it has to be within 4 floors of the finished of the highest floor of construction. Goes up with the building. It's the only type of um, requirement. It's the only type of construction rather for that requirement. So in conclusion, I'll leave a couple minutes for questions, but I've always said what is predictable is preventable. I follow uh, construction fires all over the country and find out what went wrong. I try to find out, look for emerging trends, lessons learned, that kind of thing. And I have yet to come by a construction fire that wasn't predictable and preventable. So today we talked about the risk and hazards on construction sites. You know, there's a lot of sources of ignition, a lot of sources of fuel, uh, equipment, hazmats, no shortage of hazards and risk. But there are codes and standards that covered it. NFP 241, IFC Chapter 33, NFP 1 Chapter 16. You know, they don't get a free pass when it comes to fire safety code requirements just because it's under construction. We talked about some best practices because a lot of times these best practices wind up in the code. So um, we reviewed those, and these best practices could be something that your jurisdiction requires because of to mitigate an extra hazard. Like if you're in one of those little towns that have a small fire department and want to put a big apartment building up, you might go above the code or make them require a best practice to mitigate the extra hazards. And then we talked about fire safety plans. We went through components of a well-prepared fire safety plan. Now, on the Construction Fire Safety Coalition website, we have a toolkit on there. And in the toolkit, they have a template of a fire safety plan. I'm really trying to make it as easy for the construction sites to comply as possible. So between the fire safety app to help with the daily self-inspection, National Association of State Fire Marshals coming up with training, and on the Construction Fire Safety Coalition's website, template fire safety plans where they can fill in the blank and they can make it site specific, because these are not cookie cutter plans. I mean, the plan that I'm giving out is a cookie cutter, but it's a cookie cutter that's supposed to be amended and revised and altered due to site specific issues. And but I have it in Word, so it can be altered. It can be, you know, a logo can be slapped on it, whatever. But I urge people to go check out the Fire Safety Coalition's website. And I want to thank everybody, and I have time for some questions. If anybody has any questions, please, I guess, put them in the chat box, and Kim will let me know. Thank you for your attention today. If you have any questions, I could be reached through the American Wood Council website. And have a great day and stay fire safe.
All right. Thank you so much, Ray, for such an informative presentation. And we have some time for just a few questions from our audience today. So let's dive right in. Our first question that we have is, why don't jurisdictions make builders turn on sprinkler systems as soon as they are installed?
The problem with that is when the builder is building, you have builder's risk insurance. And the largest claim for builder's risk insurance is flooding, water damage not from flooding. So to mitigate that, they jack the deductibles up to mitigate their risk. So that's a disincentive of turning on the sprinkler system. Plus, actually, sprinkler designers, I wrote an article about this for Fire Engineering Magazine. Sprinklers designers and installers aren't particularly crazy about charging those systems before the building is fully complete for a lot of reasons. One reason is that if the head gets knocked off, they got to go replace it. They might be responsible for the water damage. And in some areas of the country, you simply can't because the building isn't conditioned yet and the weather. So it's not one reason, it's a bunch of reasons.
Right. Got it. Thank you. Another question that came in, someone wants to know, am I seeing increased site security in light of all these fires?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have not seen an increase in site security. I'm hoping to because of the code requirements that were put in recently. But construction managers, they worry about the site logistics being interfered with. They also, they look at it as unneeded expense, and because nobody ever thinks they're going to have a fire, so
Right,
if they're going to save money, they're going to save money on that kind of stuff. A good site security would have prevented that fire in Boundbrook.
And then I think we have time for just about one more question. Someone wants to know, are there any ideas about why these fires occur more in colder months?
Well, a couple things. One, obviously, is space heaters are widely used and usually left unattended, which are not supposed to be. People use burn barrels to stay warm. That's two reasons. The other thing is it gets dark earlier, so there's less early notification. People aren't out as much in the winter time as they are in nice weather, at least where I live. South it's always nice, but it gets dark earlier, so people are off the streets earlier, so these fires aren't discovered until they are far gone.
Right. Right. Thank you so much. And I think that is about all the time that we have for today. But before we say goodbye, we have a special announcement for our Code Official Connection partners. We are about to launch a new way to utilize both our store and education platform under one username and password. And more information will be coming to you in an email early next week. So once again, thank you so much, Ray, for such an informative presentation. And a huge thank you to our learners for joining us today. Our next webinar is May 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's going to be on the 2021 IRC deck codes. I hope you'll join us then. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.